New York City has always sold the same story, that power here is earned, that leadership rises from the people, and that every mayor represents the soul of the city. But if you actually look, really look, across the last century of mayors, a very different pattern appears. Because the truth is, every era of New York leadership wasn't shaped by personality, it was shaped by pressure. Crime waves, Wall Street crashes, racial tension, housing chaos, immigration surges, corruption scandals. Each mayor didn't control the moment controlled them. And once you line them up, one after another, you start to see a cycle repeating. Promises made, promises broken, and the people of New York caught in the middle. Today, we're breaking down every major mayoral era, how each one changed the city, and how their decisions still shape the New York you walk in today. When people romanticize old New York, they imagine a city filled with grit, jazz clubs, immigrant dreams, and street corner ambition. But the truth is far less poetic. In the early 20th century, New York wasn't a land of opportunity. It was a battlefield controlled by political machines that treated the city like their private property. And no force was more dominant, more legendary, or more corrupt than Tammany Hall. This was a system where your success didn't depend on your talent, it depended on your loyalty. Jobs, housing, police favors, business permits, everything flowed through a network of party bosses who acted like kings. Ordinary New Yorkers weren't citizens, they were clients. Dependents. Votes to be managed. And into that world stepped a mayor like Jimmy Walker, a man who practically embodied the system. Charming, stylish, adored by the public, but tied to corruption investigations, scandals, and backroom alliances. Walker wasn't evil, he was simply a product of the environment. When your city runs on deals, you become a deal maker. When the machine feeds you power, you become its performer. But machines create pressure, and pressure creates backlash. By the time the Great Depression hit, New Yorkers were tired of cronyism, tired of backroom deals, tired of a city collapsing under the weight of insider politics. They wanted someone different, someone who didn't treat public office like a nightclub VIP list. That's when Fiorello La Guardia arrived like a political earthquake. La Guardia didn't just win an election, he broke a dynasty. He dismantled Tammany influence by going around them entirely. Instead of relying on local political bosses, he went straight to Washington, tapping into President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal funds. And with that federal support, he rebuilt New York piece by piece, airports, parks, bridges, public housing, and one of the most ambitious infrastructure expansions in the city's history. Where Walker smiled his way through corruption hearings, La Guardia held up the city's newspapers on radio broadcasts and told New Yorkers the truth. Real truth. Unfiltered, unpolished, and often uncomfortable. La Guardia represented something New Yorkers rarely saw at the time, a mayor not captured by the system, but fighting to replace it. But here's the twist. The problems he faced back then are the same ones New York still struggles with today. Mass immigration? La Guardia dealt with waves of newcomers trying to survive in overcrowded tenements. Transit instability? He fought over subway control and public versus private ownership. Crime and policing? The NYPD was already wrestling with corruption, discipline issues, and racial tensions. Class division? Manhattan was rich, outer boroughs were ignored. The same story we hear now. It's almost eerie how little changes. And that's the deeper point. New York's political identity was never about personalities. It was shaped by crisis. The early mayors were forced to choose, serve the machine, or serve the people. And that tension, people versus power, wrote the DNA of the city's politics for generations. La Guardia tried to create a city where merit mattered more than connections. But as we'll see in the next chapter, even when the machine was weakened, the city still spiraled into new battles, fiscal collapse, racial tension, rising crime. Because when you remove one power system, another one doesn't magically appear. The city enters a vacuum. And vacuums in New York never stay empty for long. When Ed Koch stepped into office in 1978, New York wasn't a city, it was a warning. A warning about what happens when mismanagement, corruption, and economic collapse finally come due. The city had just avoided bankruptcy. Crime was exploding. The subways were covered in graffiti and breaking down every other day. Entire neighborhoods were burning from arson for-profit schemes. New Yorkers weren't asking for miracles, they were asking for survival. Koch understood that. His biggest achievement was simple but profound. He stabilized the city's finances. He brought discipline back into a government that had been operating like a reckless corporation on the brink of closure. But here's the uncomfortable truth. While the books improved, ordinary life didn't. Because you can't balance your way out of fear. Crime continued climbing. The economy kept shifting. And racial tensions were bubbling in a city already divided by class, geography, and suspicion. Koch's leadership style, tough, blunt, sometimes insensitive, helped him win political battles, but it also deepened cultural fractures. And New Yorkers felt it. They felt it on the subway platforms, in abandoned buildings, in the rising number of murders, in the feeling that no matter how much the city cleaned up its finances, the streets were slipping away. By the time Koch left office, the city wasn't optimistic, it was exhausted. And that exhaustion landed on the shoulders of David Dinkins, the city's first black mayor, elected in a moment loaded with history, symbolism, and pressure. Dinkins didn't walk into a city, he walked into a storm. The crack epidemic was tearing through families. Violent crime hit historic highs. Neighborhoods like Brownsville, East New York, and Harlem were dealing with poverty levels that rivaled developing nations. And the subway system, the lifeline of the city, was decaying so badly that fires, derailments, and delays became normal. Imagine trying to govern when every institution you rely on is collapsing in real time. But the most defining challenge came in the form of racial tension, especially the Crown Heights riots in 1991. Media coverage turned Dinkins into a caricature, cast as a weak leader, too gentle, too slow, too professorial for the crisis. But the truth is more complicated. He was trying to calm a city that no longer trusted its own reflection. And while the headlines painted him as passive, Dinkins quietly passed one of the most consequential public safety plans in New York history. Safe streets, safe city, a long-term investment to hire thousands of additional police officers, expand community policing, and rebuild youth programs. That plan became the foundation for the historic crime drop that New Yorkers later credited to the next mayor, Rudy Giuliani. This is the ideological irony of the era. Some leaders are judged not by what they fix, but by what they inherit. And Dinkins inherited a city at rock bottom. Data shows that crime began declining in the very last years of his term, but media narratives never rewarded him. Instead, New Yorkers wanted someone forceful, someone aggressive, someone who projected control in a moment when the city felt uncontrollable. Emotion beat statistics. Headlines beat policy. And that emotional turning point, fear mixed with frustration, set New York up for a new era. A tougher era. An era where the demand for order became louder than the demand for fairness. When Rudy Giuliani took office in 1994, New York wasn't unstable, it was unraveling. Crime had become part of the city's identity. Parents planned their routes around danger zones. Subway riders sat with their backs against the wall. Businesses kept two budgets, one for operations and one for security. And every New Yorker, whether they lived in the Bronx or Staten Island, felt the same thing. The city was slipping away. Giuliani arrived promising one thing: order. Not hope, not healing, not unity, order. And many New Yorkers were ready to take that deal. His strategy was built on the now famous, and still controversial, philosophy of broken windows policing. The idea was simple: you fix the small crimes first, and the big crimes follow. If a street tolerates graffiti, turnstile jumping, and open-air drug dealing, it sends a message that rules don't matter. Giuliani flipped the script by policing minor offenses aggressively, believing it would deter major ones. But here's where the political tension begins, because while that approach did reshape New York, it also unleashed a new form of state power. Suddenly, the NYPD wasn't just fighting crime, it was enforcing a behavioral code. Minor infractions became arrestable. Neighborhoods of color felt targeted. And the line between public safety and overpolicing began to blur. Yet, undeniably, crime fell, and it fell fast. Murders dropped. Robberies dropped. Subway crime plummeted. Times Square, once a symbol of urban decay, became a glowing Disney-ified tourist hub. Wall Street surged into a booming financial era. And the world looked at New York as a case study in tough leadership. But that's the hero-villain dynamic of this era. Was Giuliani saving the city, or controlling it? He centralized power in a way no modern mayor had. Press briefings became battles. Commissioners reported directly to him. The NYPD's authority expanded dramatically, with new tactics, new units, and a new culture of hyper-enforcement. Supporters said he gave police the tools they needed. Critics said he gave them permission to overreach, to profile, to escalate. And both narratives contain truth. The ideological lesson here is uncomfortable but real. When elites promise safety, they rarely mention the fine print: civil liberties. And in the 1990s, most New Yorkers were willing to sign that contract. Fear makes people choose strength over nuance. Giuliani understood something deeper about power. Order is emotional. People don't evaluate crime statistics, they evaluate how safe they feel. And he mastered that psychological battlefield. His leadership wasn't gentle, but it was effective in the most measurable sense. By the late 90s, New York was one of the safest big cities in America. But power never disappears, it transforms. And Giuliani's model created a template that every future mayor had to deal with. Some tried to expand it. Some tried to escape it. But none could ignore it. Because Giuliani had reset expectations, suddenly, safety wasn't a goal, it was a standard. And that leads us to the next era, one defined not by force, but by data. A billionaire technocrat who believed cities should run like a company. A man who took Giuliani's order and tried to turn it into efficiency. When Michael Bloomberg became mayor in 2002, New York wasn't just wounded, it was traumatized. The city was still covered in ash from 9/11, families were mourning, businesses were closing, and the global perception of New York had changed almost overnight. People wanted stability. They wanted competence. They wanted someone who could rebuild not just buildings, but confidence. And Bloomberg stepped in not as a politician, but as a CEO. A man who talked less about ideology and more about metrics. Less about speeches and more about spreadsheets. He approached New York like a company that had lost its biggest client and needed a full structural reset. And in many ways, that mindset worked. He modernized the bureaucracy, pushed data-driven policing under the now famous CompStat system, expanded parks, bike lanes, waterfronts, and turned the city's infrastructure into something resembling a 21st-century metropolis. Rezoning became his superpower. Under Bloomberg, nearly 40% of the city's land was rezoned, one of the largest zoning overhauls in American history. That single decision changed skylines, created new neighborhoods, and transformed industrial zones into residential hubs. Hudson Yards, Long Island City, Williamsburg, all reshaped under the Bloomberg vision. But that vision came with consequences. As new buildings rose, so did rents. As new parks appeared, so did luxury towers. As the city became cleaner and shinier, it also became more expensive. In some neighborhoods, unrecognizable. Critics argued that Bloomberg's New York wasn't designed for the people who lived here, it was designed for the people who could afford to move here. A city increasingly shaped by global wealth, investors from Europe, Asia, Silicon Valley, who saw New York real estate as an asset class, not a home. And then there was stop and frisk, expanded dramatically under Bloomberg's leadership. The policy was defended with cold, statistical reasoning, police needed flexibility, data supported the strategy, crime was down. But the lived reality was different. Black and Latino New Yorkers were stopped at massively disproportionate rates, often without cause, creating a sense of surveillance and distrust. Bloomberg's New York was safe on paper, but tense on the ground. This is where the ideological fault line becomes clear. Bloomberg built prosperity, but did he distribute opportunity? Did New York become more inclusive, or more exclusive? Because Bloomberg's philosophy was straightforward, cities should operate efficiently, predictably, and profitably, like a high-performing corporation. But people don't live like corporations. Communities aren't spreadsheets. And neighborhoods aren't assets. The city transformed, yes, but so did the feeling of who the city was for. For some, Bloomberg saved New York. For others, he sold it. Still, his legacy is undeniable. The modern skyline? Bloomberg. The explosion of tourism? Bloomberg. New parks, new developments, new transit upgrades? Bloomberg. An economy increasingly tied to global capital? Also Bloomberg. His impact was permanent, a new template for what a modern mayor looks like, technocratic, data-driven, managerial, detached from retail politics. But here's the twist. When you run a city like a corporation, people eventually push back like workers. And that backlash, rising inequality, gentrification anger, housing stress, created an opening for a very different kind of leader. Someone who didn't promise efficiency, but fairness. Someone who didn't speak in balance sheets, but in stories of inequality. When Bill de Blasio won the 2013 election, it wasn't just a victory. It was a rejection. A rejection of Bloomberg's corporate-style governance, a rejection of rising inequality, a rejection of a city that felt increasingly designed for tourists, billionaires, and investors. De Blasio ran on one powerful phrase, a tale of two cities. And that message hit home. Because by the early 2010s, New York really had split, between those who were winning in the global capital of wealth and those who were barely hanging on. De Blasio promised to rebalance that equation. He pushed universal pre-K, one of the biggest education expansions in modern city history. He spoke about policing reforms, about ending the excesses of stop and frisk, about restoring trust between communities and the NYPD. For a moment, it felt like New York might rediscover a more human, more equitable vision of leadership. But politics is never just ideas, it's resistance. And de Blasio ran directly into a wall of it. The NYPD turned on him almost immediately. Officers publicly protested him. Police unions accused him of being anti-cop. Media outlets hammered him relentlessly, often focusing more on his personal quirks than his policies. Bureaucracy slowed his agenda. Internal scandals, some real, some exaggerated, chipped away at the image of the progressive reformer. And while some of his programs succeeded, the expectations he created were impossible to sustain. Because here's the truth, it's easier to criticize a system than to change one. Especially a system as massive, entrenched, and political as New York's. By the time de Blasio left office, New Yorkers weren't hopeful, they were frustrated. Crime concerns were rising again. Homelessness was more visible. COVID had ripped through the city, exposing every inequality and every weakness in public health, transit, housing, and governance. The city wasn't just hurting, it was traumatized. And into that trauma stepped Eric Adams, a former NYPD captain who promised a different kind of leadership. Not progressive, not technocratic, but pragmatic. Street smart. A mayor who claimed he understood both sides of the badge. Adams took office during one of the most volatile periods in modern NYC history. Crime anxiety was rising. The subway system felt unsafe. A historic migrant influx was overwhelming shelters and social services. The city budget was strained. Trust in institutions, government, media, police, was collapsing. Political polarization was the highest in decades. New Yorkers weren't demanding ideology, they were demanding competence. But the challenge Adams faced wasn't just policy, it was psychology. The psychology of a city that no longer believed its leaders could fix anything. And that's the ideological shift of the modern era. Mayors today aren't managers, they are crisis navigators. They inherit fires, not blueprints. Trauma, not optimism. Adams tried using his police background to reassure the public. He tried using charisma to restore confidence. But the issues he faced, from budget cuts to the migrant crisis, were larger than any one administration. And the public, tired of promises, judged him by perception more than progress. Which brings us to the cyclical truth of New York politics. Every mayor promises a new New York. Every mayor believes they will reset the city. But the problems of New York, inequality, policing, housing, immigration, safety, outlive the people elected to solve them. And yet, every 4 or 8 years, New Yorkers line up to try again. Because this city, for all its chaos, all its contradictions, still believes in reinvention. And that belief is what drives the next era, whatever it becomes.